everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today entitled Evaluating Resiliency in the Global Enterprise. My name is Mark Schlesinger. I'm Director of Strategic Partners for the Americas here at Orange Business Services, and I'll be leading our session today. Before we get started, allow me to kind of set the stage for everybody so you understand the context which we're starting from. As you know, we're witnessing some unprecedented changes in the world today due to the impact of COVID-19. And as a result, we're seeing quite a bit of re-vectoring of the enterprise in terms of their priorities and things they're focusing on as a matter of urgency. This is the first of our Leading with Partners series, where we'll be discussing some emerging trends in the market as renewed focus on business resiliency takes hold of the global multinational companies that we typically serve. What you will see here today is our session entitled a series of sessions entitled Business Resiliency in All Times. Throughout this series, our intention is to give you information and thought leadership that will support enterprises through the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. We have over 20 webinars planned for this series, and they fall into three basic categories. Today, this is our Leading with Partners series, where I will be interviewing technology leaders and our partners, as well as advisory firms, to get their insight and thought leadership on the issues of today. In addition to that, we have the Next Normal series, which is a 12 webinar series that is brought to you by my colleagues at Orange Silicon Valley, who are presenting together with external Silicon Valley innovation leaders to share their perspective on some of the new behaviors in selected verticals, societal changes and market opportunities, as well as emerging threats that are impacting business leaders and the COVID-19 world. And then lastly is our Enterprise Solutions series, which is brought to you by my colleagues at Orange Business Services. These webinars provide perspectives on IT technology, solutions that will help enterprises to recraft their digital strategies in light of the pandemic. Today's topic, again, is part of our Leading with Partners series. And joining me today will be Jeff Schwartz, Vice President of North American Engineering at Check Point. Jeff has some great insights to share with us on the emerging trends in enterprise cybersecurity. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Samir Al-Rashidi, who leads pre-sales solutions here in the Americas for Orange Business Services as well. Samir is going to help with the Q&A throughout the process of this our discussion. A couple of quick housekeeping items. You can enter your questions with your first name automatically appearing for all to see by using the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen. Or if you prefer a more private space, then you can anonymously submit questions using the questions area on the right side as well. Only Samir, Jeff, and I will be able to see comments in the questions area. So let's go ahead and get started. I pre-submitted to Jeff 3 topics, and I think I believe will be important for you and our audience today. They are how the cloud is impacting the cybersecurity landscape, why and how endpoint security is growing concern for the C-suite, and as well as understanding new threats and how our partnership is responding to those new threats in today's demanding market. So to kick things off, our first topic, Jeff, is how cloud is impacting the cybersecurity landscape. Prior to the impact from COVID-19 pandemic, at OBS, we were already witnessing an aggression migration to cloud-based solutions and services. Add now the forced adoption of working from home in the enterprise, we are seeing unprecedented growth in this space. With the expansion of cloud consumption, cybersecurity starts to move even further into the forefront of consideration for multinational corporations. What's Check Point's view on this?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Mark. So there's 3 areas that I think cloud is significantly impacting security operations and security outcomes. The first relates to the fact that when we would traditionally build environments and data centers and traditional application service delivery models, they would be centered around a very strict or rigorous adherence to an architectural design and implementation of that design. So in other words, when we design a data center, we would have very clear identified architectures, and we would know where every connection and every wire in and out of that data center and how it connects and what its purpose was and how to troubleshoot and diagnose issues associated with that. So from a security perspective, there was a very well-defined template or this end state of what the infrastructure will look like. When we talk about cloud, there's many unseen wires or connections or for permissions, for usage, for metadata that's shared with the cloud provider. And when we talk about SaaS and IaaS and PaaS, when we talk about serverless functions or containerized delivery of applications, the connectedness between the infrastructure and the application that's being delivered vary very, very widely. So one, we've lost a high degree of visibility into what's happening in these environments. The second factor that's driving the challenges associated with securing cloud adequately is that our business partners are driving very high degrees of agility. And kind of like when my kids download an application to their smartphone, 30 seconds later they decide they don't like it, they can delete the app and download a new app. And many users in our business community, the business partners that we all support, they have a similar expectation of access of resources. That why can't I access everything from my phone or my home asset or resource, or why can't I test an application in Workday or Salesforce, or why can't we use Slack or Teams or Blue Jeans as a collaboration tool? And they're not going through necessarily the corporate umbrella of access, that they're creating an account with a credit card or their own, if some of the service providers offer a freemium model where they can get some basic level of access, and they're connecting the enterprise to this external service. So the speed that our business partners are asking us to move is incongruent with the traditional IT change control processes. And we see this, as part of CI/CD pipeline challenges, and we see this as organizations try to shift left, that their needs are to provide security earlier in the development cycle. So we have application developers that are, and as I'll talk about what's on the slide in a second here, but as application owners and developers are racing to deliver on these very accelerated timelines, that security is kind of a backseat to that, and that they're not asking for security or operational governance to be adhered to as they roll these applications out. Get it out fast, see if it's broken, and fix it quickly is kind of the model. But when we look at the vendors and the vendor exposure that this introduces, this is what we're looking at is a screenshot of the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which, for those of you not familiar, it's a mechanism to measure the principal characteristics of any individual CVE or vulnerability, and provide a quantitative metric so organizations can prioritize what's important. So, for example, CVEs rated 9 and higher are really bad. And what really bad means is that they can be launched remotely, that they don't require physical access to the asset, that they don't require, they require either little or no user intervention to exploit, and that the diversity or the breadth of install base that is susceptible to this vulnerability is very, very high. So what we see here is that we have many vendors that take security seriously, mind you, like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Cisco, et cetera, that a high percentage of their CVEs are rated 9 and higher. So this accelerating adoption of new technologies and new solutions and application delivery is increasing the surface area of exposure, while at the same time, going back to my first point, all the hidden wires of what's actually happening in the cloud are more abstracted to us, so we can't really see them the way they are in a traditional data center. And then the third factor here is that our business partners are adopting technologies that are wildly outside of our control. So when we talk about the rate of scale and the rate of change, that this problem is accelerating at an accelerating pace. So, a simple example of what this looks like from a cloud perspective is this is a VPC flow log, and 99% of us would not be able to make heads or tails of what this looks like, and certainly in real time, and certainly at scale that cloud traffic is being logged. But looking at this, what it actually is a Lambda function talking to a malicious destination. Now, how do you secure this when there's no network to attach in front of a Lambda function? How do you secure this? There's no agent to install on an application server or web server. And the malicious IP is dynamic, and the Lambda function is dynamic. That the asset that is conducting the communications is also ephemeral or transient. So securing these types of things in real time and in to the extent possible before they're published into some type of production environment illustrates. This is a very simple example that illustrates the nature of what organizations are wrestling with. Now, when you apply this to multi-cloud and hybrid cloud environments where, again, organizations are adopting multiple SaaS applications, IaaS platforms very, very quickly, that the scale of this is not only real, but it's tangible from an operational perspective, that the impact from a security outcome perspective is going to get worse by meaningful degrees, because many organizations are struggling to evolve their environment to support these types of dynamic environments with hybrid assets and multi-cloud assets.
Oh, thanks for that, Jeff. So before we transition things over to Samir to see if we have any questions from our audience, talk to me a little bit about what you may see as a best practice to address this impact around cloud adoption, and certainly some of the complexities that are associated with what you just highlighted with us, right? We can't really see where all these things are going any longer because the wires are missing.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and just kind of reflecting back on the well-secured environments of yesteryear when we had kind of traditional data centers, how we solved those problems was with point solutions. So we would have, let's say, a mail security gateway. We would have a URL filtering proxy solution. We'd have a sandbox. We'd have a firewall or next-gen firewall. We'd have advanced IPS. We'd have malware detection capabilities. But these would all be independent solutions. So now when you take those independent solutions and try to apply them to something like what's on the screen now with a Lambda function talking to a malicious destination, it's impossible or nearly impossible to take individual solutions and stack them in front of this type of communication or this type of application access. So, the solution, the approach fundamentally needs to be different than how we've applied security in the past. And what the key ingredients that are required here is, one, that there needs to be focus on qualitative advantage in the case of preventative controls. And what I mean by qualitative advantage is that that at the scale that organizations are adopting cloud and the volume that is seen and the diversity of traffic that is seen in many cloud environments requires qualitative advantage, that good enough, let's say native controls or good enough security that that there may be some degree of perceived commoditization in certain technology areas is not really good enough in cloud, because a 1% difference in security efficacy in an organization that gets a million emails a day, which is not a huge organization, but let's just say a million emails a day for simple math, that translates to 10,000 false negatives or unknown artifacts that will transit that environment. Now, again, you could scale up and scale down based on the size of your environment, but even small degrees of difference in security efficacy translate to very large differences in security outcomes when we talk about cloud. So that's the first thing. One, there needs to be qualitative advantage. The second thing is there needs to be portability of controls. That, if you were using, let's say, Proofpoint for mail security and FireEye for sandboxing and Blue Code for proxy, and you had this kind of stacked security perimeter, that doesn't work anymore, because there needs to be portability to align to achieve the agility that your business partners are demanding. That, oh, we're going to move to GCP because Google's going to sell their consumer analytics that they have on 3 billion users that use Chrome browsers. So to be able to provide portability of controls across different environments in an agile fashion is a fundamental element. So the second element, it needs to include portability of controls across, things like mobile, endpoint, which we'll talk about later, and the diversity of cloud technologies, whether it's things like Kubernetes that are on-prem and in cloud, using Fargate with AWS, using things in Azure, Google Functions or Azure Functions in terms of Lambda or function as a service, similar to what's shown on the screen. So those are the two elements: portability and qualitative advantage.
Great. Thanks for that, Jeff. Samir, any questions we want to cover from the audience relating to cloud adoption and the impact it's having on the cybersecurity landscape?
Yeah, we have a couple, and thanks for everyone. Keep submitting your questions. I think there's one that is tied to what you were talking about in terms of cloud, as well as the different software as a service, as well as companies implementing public hybrid cloud, right? And it's around what your view is on the most beneficial or disruptive technologies around cloud security and the adoption of cloud, right? How do you see that?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about SaaS, it's very as the infrastructure suggests, it's very application specific. And for example, securing Office 365 is vastly different than providing security for Salesforce or Workday or Dropbox. So security in each context needs to be very contextually relevant to that application. But when we talk about disruption, innovation is really the hallmark of the security industry. It really is a kind of an arms race between good and bad, and adoption of how those the innovations can be operationalized. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge for many organizations, that it's not the ability to identify innovations, it's the ability to operationalize those innovations. And I think that that's where, obviously partners such as, Orange Business Services, and where we've been able to work with our partners to be able to deliver better security outcomes in these areas. But the operational element is really key, because there's many niche technologies, let's say for runtime security for containers, or for cloud security posture management, or cloud workload protection. And when we talk about these different areas, if you pull up the Gartner Magic Quadrant or Gartner analysis for some of these things, they may say this dot belongs here and this dot belongs there. But what really matters, it doesn't matter where the dots are. What matters is, what is the operational capacity of the organization to implement, maintain, and support these technologies as part of their life cycle. That we moved away from this SDLC software, life cycle development, and more to CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, and being able to secure infrastructure that can be operationalized in a consistent, automated, continuous fashion is really the important elements here to focus on. And to do that consistently across different infrastructure types and different applications requires more of a platform-based approach than a point solution approach, which is what got us into this kind of operational challenge to begin with.
Samir, anything else that we wanted to cover there or on that topic?
No, I think we're good. There keep more questions coming, but let's wait for more topics, as I know people are going to get deeper into this topic.
Great. So moving on to our second topic, and as it relates slightly to cloud adoption, is a discussion I wanted to have around endpoint security. Everybody's talking about endpoint security. And of course, that's having a tremendous impact now on the C-suite and whether or not they're able to get much sleep at night anymore. Of course, you lay that into the conversation we just had around cloud adoption, it starts to change the conversation quite considerably. So one of the things that we've been seeing at Orange Business Services is around threat detection and threat response, basically threat intelligence in general. At the edge is becoming a top concern for the enterprise. The CISO now has so much more to worry about, including speed to resolution, and keeping up to date with the latest attacks, organizational adjustments that are affecting the geopolitical landscape, and all of those kind of exciting things. Is this something that Checkpoint is seeing? And what is your view on this?
Yeah, no, it's an important area because, and I think we show it here. Actually, I think it was in the next one. Actually, it was in the last one. So actually, there was a survey from CSO Online from earlier this year, obviously pre-COVID, that reflected on what are the greatest security challenges that organizations face in 2020. And I was amazed to see that phishing and ransomware and banking Trojans still in 2020 remain to be some of the highest security concerns that C-levels are wrestling with from a security operations perspective. That we really have not solved these problems in a thorough way, and that we still contend with the end user element. And I think part of what's contributing to that, and certainly, it's been accelerated by the vast increases in work from home, is the diversity of application and user access. That, when a user sits in an office, there's some informal assumption that they're secured by this big, expensive, robust security stack that lives at the perimeter. And now they work from home, their expectations around application access are completely the same, even though they're connecting from their home, generally unsecured Wi-Fi. They may be working from, let's say, public Wi-Fi by either a retail outlet or few people are going to restaurants these days. But if Starbucks or Panera offer Wi-Fi and they're accessing from, let's say, unsecured assets or lightly secured assets that are under the presumption that everything's coming back to the data center or the headquarters facilities, and now they're accessing Office 365 directly. They're accessing Dropbox, Salesforce, et cetera, directly. Meanwhile, if these applications were deployed in a traditional data center environment, we would never in 1 million years deploy them with the equivalent security of what we have today from they connect to their Wi-Fi and just, it's the equivalent of what many organizations have in their guest networks, their guest Wi-Fi in a corporate environment. That, yes, it's kind of internet at large access and, buyer beware. But that's how our end user communities are now accessing everything that in many cases has sensitive or critical assets or have certainly sensitive information relative to business operations. And the challenge is that, and it's kind of accelerating the advent of the SASE market, which Gartner's recently spoke on, Secure Access Service Edge, where there needs to be security that's identified at the endpoint, and here we can advance some of these. But that the endpoint is very central to this. That there needs to be posture checking on the asset. What is the nature of the asset? What is the security threshold of the asset? Does it have, let's say, machine-based certificate authentication? Is the user authenticating with just an AD password? Are they using some MFA or single sign-on? What is the nature of the authentication? What is the nature of the asset they're coming from? What is the nature of the network that they're coming from? Is there man-in-the-middle being conducted? Are we securing against those man-in-the-middle efforts? And what is the asset that they're accessing? And what is the nature and security sitting behind or in front of that asset? That if they're accessing a SaaS delivered application that you don't necessarily have access to because of the quote-unquote hidden wires, that do we want to restrict the content in some meaningful way or provide alerting based on certain triggered behavior back to the headquarters facility or security operations. So taking a combination, taking a holistic picture of what's happening on the endpoint, the user, the infrastructure between that endpoint and user and the application, and what is being accessed from the application. And that is what historically we've addressed this in a very point-centric fashion, that we have, let's say, an EDR, we have a next-gen AV, we have, let's say, disk encryption, we have, let's say, some type of web proxy for remote users, and we're able to provide some degree of independent controls on that asset. But when we look at it in a holistic way, in terms of how we operationalizing all these elements, and what is the portability of controls that we have for this infrastructure and these user populations relative to the applications that we're trying to secure, and being able to secure both ends of that. So that's part of the challenge we see, and this is why when we look at endpoint attacks, that we still see phishing as a very large component of what end users are being compromised with, because they're looking at volume. They're looking to address, malicious actors are looking to simply solve a mathematical problem. If I send this to 10,000 users, I will get one to click on it. And malicious URLs, as part of phishing attacks, are much like tissues. They're single use. You use them once, you throw them away, and you never see them again. So while these reputational services and cloud-based reputational services are valuable, at scale they're generally ineffective, because each URL is seen once. The reputational services will take 12 to 24 hours to register that URL as malicious, and by that time the users, maybe small percentages of users will have clicked on the link. So we need to solve these problems in a much more integrated, holistic fashion that addresses these things at runtime on the asset, and not with these more generalized solutions. But again, when we look at what's necessary here, there needs to be qualitative advantage, and the lack of qualitative advantage in solving this problem, at runtime on the endpoint, is one illustration of why something like phishing in the year of 2020 is still one of the most prolific problems that security teams wrestle with.
Interesting. Samir, how about our audience? Any questions from them?
Yeah, actually, we have a couple of questions. The first one, I think it's around endpoint and endpoint security, right? And asks about which approach you think it's best between SASE and Zero Trust. So maybe you talk a little bit about SASE and the concept of SASE. But I wanted to go a step further, right? Can they work together? Is there like a hybrid model there that SASE works with Zero Trust?
Yeah, so I think Zero Trust is a good approach. It's a very powerful conceptual architecture for providing security in these environments. But I think at the end of the day, including Checkpoint, that are focused on this. But what's unique to the space in terms of approach is being able to identify platform-based approaches that providing there's endpoint approaches, there's Zero Trust network access approaches from a cloud-centric element, but the absence of either one creates a huge problem based on the scale and the diversity of challenges that organizations face from a security perspective, with things like phishing and endpoint compromise that we just touched on. So you cannot solve this problem with a kind of piecemeal solution. That the solution needs to have strong posture management. It needs to have strong endpoint security controls that are preventative, like next-gen AV. It needs to have EDR. It needs to provide this full suite, and the platform needs to be able to support, obviously, Zero Trust models for cloud access to applications, because applications, it's no longer defined based on, let's say, a protected encryption domain that's well defined based on addresses. It's the access is tag based or dynamic assets based on either FQDN or some other tag-based application that requires portability across different environments, and whether the application has elements in IaaS or elements in the traditional data center, that the access needs to be highly dynamic and the security needs to be consistent across the elements that are in your data center and the elements that are in, let's say, an IaaS or a more dynamic environment. But at the same time, there needs to be an approach that takes into account the endpoint posture, the endpoint controls, and enforcement capabilities, and not just kind of telling you it's raining outside and alerting you that, this endpoint may be compromised. Well, what do you do about it? What's the plan? I mean, if the endpoint might be compromised, does that mean that the application element also now needs to be quarantined because that's what they were accessing? Or does it mean that that entire user population that is manifested or demonstrated similar behavior needs to be quarantined? And being able to automate these things in a continuous fashion to be able to provide ongoing security in a tangible way are critical from a preventative perspective. And that's where I think many of the solutions like Zscaler have been very strong in terms of providing the access, but from an endpoint security perspective, with if the endpoint's compromised with a phishing URL, which again is kind of a simplistic attack that we see day in, day out, and we continue to wrestle with as an industry, then that the cloud access piece is almost a trivial element to achieve, but we need to incorporate it into the endpoint security model.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeff. So we're approaching our third and final topic, and I want to be careful of your time as well as our audience's time today. So our last topic has to do with new threats and what our partnership is doing in response to them. So I'd like to break that down into a couple of components, right? Understanding what you're seeing as a new threat, and what we're seeing from an information consolidation or dashboard consolidation is probably one of the most challenging aspects of managing security in the enterprise that you just highlighted a few minutes ago. With all the tools and with all the new, innovation, as you called it earlier, a lot of reactivity or proactivity is required. I know internally at Orange Business Services, we're looking at Dome9 integration into our portfolio. But before we talk about that in evolution, let's talk about some of the new threats like I had mentioned, right? Any of your insight that you can share there we'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. So actually, this is the screenshot that I was searching for a moment ago. But this is the published hit list or hot trends from earlier this year from CSO. That for example, phishing is still here, banking Trojans are still here. Obviously, IoT is here. What we're seeing from a trend perspective is leveraging more modern areas of infection. And it's the same attacks on new or more modern infrastructure. And a good example of this is protecting an organization from an infected file. If someone sends an infected file to a target institution, there's 9 different attack vectors that upwards and generalizing in some of these areas, but there's upwards of 9 attack vectors that can infect that organization: mobile devices, web downloads, corporate email, shared folder, endpoint device, FTP, messaging apps, SaaS applications, or private email. And today, organizations would have up to 8 different security technologies to mitigate those 9 attack vectors. And what we're left with is 72 permutations of protections. And this is what has slowed us down as an industry. So the real evolution of things is if and the important questions that we ask ourselves as an industry is, if we were to extend that to, let's say, more complex scenarios, let's say not just infected files, but fairly well understood attack vectors, and the mitigating controls to reduce the risk associated with those threats, we would have a very large math problem of permutations that would be very difficult to complete in a thorough way. And if we kind of iterate this to the next 3 technologies or attack vectors that we can expect to see, and we iterate that against the next 3 technologies that would be relevant to mitigate those, we literally double the number of permutations that need to be secured. So providing this with the paradigm or the model that we leveraged in the past is no longer sufficient to operationalize and be able to solve these problems in a scalable way moving forward. And that's actually one of the things that we're focused on, is be able to solve these things with qualitative advantage, with the agility to be able to support whatever the next evolving threats are in a scalable way that don't require re-engineering of everything that we've already done. And I think when we look at the security landscape, the trivial nature that social engineering and things like phishing are still so predominant and effective for malicious actors is wildly problematic. But being able to secure these types of scenarios, when now organizations are adopting, let's say they're moving to Office 365, or they're moving to SaaS-based delivery vehicles where the client is connecting directly to those resources, really illustrates the scale problem that many organizations wrestle with. What we've been able to, in working with, Orange Business Services and, many of our joint customers, is be able to solve these problems in an operationally sensitive fashion, to be able to provide real-time enforcement as well as scale to accommodate more modern challenges.
Great. Samir, how about anything from our audience?
Yeah, we had one that touched this topic actually, which is how can a company having so many different technologies, right, on the security stack, how can they improve that technology ecosystem, right, without necessarily having to go and, hey, let's do a refresh, which is not, it's a very CapEx heavy solution. Yeah. And then tied to that is around the methodology piece, which is Apesh here sent a question around what is the number one concern to the market CISOs around implementing security on the cloud? So 2 questions here, but thought you'd pick your brain, Jeff.
Yeah, no, that's great. Not buying dedicated point solutions for point problems. That there needs to be kind of in the financial markets, when things become very tumultuous and volatility increases, there's what's considered a flight to quality. What we need in our industry is a flight to platform providers that prefer incumbents in your environment for adjacent technology areas. That if you're looking for individual, you could, and not only will you still be able to maintain focus on quality and best of breed, but you'll be able to improve the security operations and versatility of your team to be able to support new and diverse environments as your business partners come to you to say, hey, we want to experiment with X. Well, X you'll be able to experiment because you already have the capabilities and know-how, and where you focused on these platform providers that provide portability to different infrastructure types, you'll be able to leverage them in an accelerated fashion operationally. So prefer platform providers, prefer incumbent platform providers where it's possible. And it doesn't necessarily have to be CapEx heavy. For example, at Checkpoint, we have kind of an infinity model where it's kind of a service subscription delivery licensing vehicle, that it's a predictable number, and you can use any product essentially in our portfolio, hardware or software, up to that threshold of the size of your organization, that when you have an endpoint project, you already have it. When you have a cloud proxy or let's say a SASE project, you already have it. So you have the permissions and licensing to use these things as the projects come up. It's truly an agile licensing model for these types of scenarios. But the second question relating to cloud security vendors, there are certain cases where you need to invest in niche solutions because there's only one solution that will provide a given problem. in the space of cloud, every organization's at kind of a different place on the spectrum or their journey. But the most pressing of which is typically cloud security posture management. That you're not going to be able to go to your application developers and say, we want to put a network firewall in front of all of our applications. We're not going to be able to install an agent on all of our Kubernetes pods. There's going to be resistance. But what there should not be resistance to is providing automated, continuous visibility and hopefully ultimately enforcement around governance of standards around what is configured in your cloud assets. What cloud assets do you have? Are they using old images with, let's say, vulnerable SSL libraries? Are they using, has someone pasted an AWS session key or authentication token into a Lambda function by mistake, of course? But these types of checks from a cloud security posture management perspective should be kind of the low ground, the low-hanging fruit that you can ensure a degree of consistency of security and kind of baseline your cloud environments. And then from there, stack on threat intelligence capabilities that are malicious actors accessing these resources, or are there compromises that's sending information to, let's say, known malicious destinations. And you could stack on the more advanced controls and security enforcement, workload protection, et cetera.
Yeah. Again, Jeff, thanks for all that. So let's just kind of quickly summarize some of the key takeaways today. I really liked your comments around making sure that you have a qualitative advantage in place, especially when you're talking about cloud adoption and the problems that Edge is taking in the enterprise. Certainly, portability of control is another good takeaway. Making sure that we can cover all dimensions of the new, I guess we'll call it the new norm, even though that's been overused so much by now, with all the work from home activity and the migration from the office. I also took away today, how important innovation is and how important operationalizing innovation is to the enterprise. The faster you're able to do that, this battle between good and bad is an important one, and you need to be able to respond, ahead of even quite a bit of the development that's coming after you on the bad side of things. Interesting that you share that phishing is still quite a hot topic today, even in 2020. I found that rather insightful. I wouldn't have thought that. The banking Trojans and ransomware that you also mentioned were interesting to get your insight on. And of course, being able to detect these problems now on the end asset is becoming more and more important, basically due to the complexity of all the things that you said. You've got all these attack vectors, you've got all these security technologies. So coming together with a consolidated dashboard that can actually manage all that for you is becoming more and more important, especially as these things continue to grow and to prepare for the next 3 new attack vectors that may start to become more visible. So that was great. I thank you for all that. As we start to wrap things up here today, I wanted to make sure that I reminded everybody that we invite you to join us for our continuing series entitled Business Resilience in All Times. As I mentioned earlier, we've got about 20 webinars that we are hosting in this category, so we welcome you to join us. Kathy is going to post a link for us to the entire series directly in the chat window now. Please know that if the dates have already passed, that you can still access those links to get to the content. The replays will be located right there. And a really big thank you, Jeff, on behalf of Orange Business Services, for joining us on for this webinar today, Evaluating Resiliency in the Global Enterprise. We are really appreciative for your comments and insights. A huge thank you to our audience, the questions that were submitted. I hope everyone found this session valuable, and thank you for choosing to spend part of your day with us. Of course, should you wish to discuss this topic in any more detail with us or with Checkpoint, provided you some email addresses of both Samir and I to feel free to reach out to us for additional discussion. And I wish everyone continue to stay safe, be well. And today, Changes with Orange. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.